Greetings everybody, I'm obviously Jesus, and here we are with the second Patreon video for the month of October 2017, which today, as a request from a friend of the show, Superhands, I will be responding to a Sargon of Akkad video entitled Illiberal Progressives. If you want to, and it's probably a good idea honestly, to get some context for the things I'm going to talk about in this video, the video will be linked in the description. Much to my chagrin, I would advise you to go through there and use ad block when you go there, because it is, as I'm going to get into, kind of a stupid fucking video. But and I don't really want to give money to this type of person, which we'll discuss here in a second. But it's a 2015 video wherein Sargon of Akkad, I had never even heard of him before, honestly, before Hans mentioned it to me, but he's this YouTuber. He has a bunch of subscribers, and he basically talks about the difference between liberals and progressives, whereas these two terms are often used interchangeably here in the United States, whereas Sargon talks about the difference between liberalism, classical liberalism, which focuses on individual liberty, and progressivism, which focuses more, or at least allegedly focuses more on a group or a collectivist mindset. And again, I really didn't know who Sargon of Akkad was before I started this video. I did end up writing a lot about it, though. I got 6, I think, 1.5 spaced pages here. My printer is shit, so I'm probably going to be staring at the pages at some points trying to read what it attempted to print. But there is a lot. We're going to be here a little while. I'm going to try to get through it as linearly as possible, because I basically wrote a script rather than an outline, because I wanted to get my thoughts on this issue correct, because it is a very convoluted issue, politically speaking, and there's a lot that I want to cover, and I don't want to be, circling back on myself constantly. But anyway, for those of you who don't know who Sargon of Akkad is, I didn't before I started this commentary, but according to his beloved Wikipedia that he constantly refers to throughout the video, the Illiberal Progressive video, which I, again, do regretfully encourage you to watch so you get the full effect of this video, because some of the stuff I'm going to reference is only in that video, and some of it's more general, and you can probably glean some stuff from that as well, but you might want to skip through or just skim that video at the very least. It's an hour and 12 minutes, I think, and I watched all of it. Believe me, I watched all of it. So yeah. But anyway, according to Wikipedia, Sargon of Akkad goes by Carl Benjamin, and in 2016 he apparently tweeted, "I wouldn't even rape you," to a British member of parliament, and he also at one point created a crowdfunding effort to defend the greatest YouTuber, really, PewDiePie. Definitely not the most banal YouTuber there is, and it's weird that you would create, I think it was a thunderclap, which I've never heard of either, probably because Kickstarter or Indiegogo would shut that shit down, but I don't know. He basically crowdfunded or crowdsourced some kind of movement to defend PewDiePie. But apparently, according to Wikipedia, he's also married with children, so basically he's the Woody's gamer tag of this pop philosophy, or pop political philosophy, or whatever you want to talk about. That's not really substantive to, and really germane to this argument that I'm going to make against all his points, but it does provide a little bit of hilarious context, and I refuse to call him Sargon from this point on. I literally did a find and replace. Everywhere I typed rather, Sargon is now Carl. I'm going to say it exactly like that every single fucking time, like the teacher from Jimmy Neutron, because that's how I feel, because it's just hysterical that there's this, British, he's probably some fat British neckbeard named Carl, and he's got all these weird, just railing on the internet against progressives who are trying to, make the world a better place, generally speaking. But anyway, let's talk about the actual substantive points of this video. He begins the video primarily with an example of Black Lives Matter protesters back in, I don't know if it was 2014 or 15, but there was a time when Black Lives Matter protesters took over a Bernie Sanders rally and basically demanded that he cede them the podium or they were going to shut this shit down or whatever. But anyway, the idea but basically Carl begins using this example as an example of a progressive position. They want the podium based on their skin color. Basically, what he's saying is these people are demanding something based on their identity politics. And maybe that's what these individual women thought, but to conflate this with the official progressive position is completely absurd. Just because Black Lives Matter is a movement that generally has been embraced by the progressive and the people who identify themselves as progressives, it doesn't mean that these two specific women who are rather selfishly demanding that Bernie Sanders give up his own rally to their opinions doesn't make them good representatives or reliable agents of Black Lives Matter, or certainly not of progressivism as a whole. And Carl makes no mention of the actual racial injustices Black people and other marginalized groups face, especially here in America. He simply cherry picks the actions of a few people who are, in fact, failing to uphold these progressive ideals such as freedom of speech. It's not just for liberals. Carl makes a big deal about how liberalism is all about free speech, freedom of expression, freedom to assemble, freedom to do this and that and the other thing. So the idea that progressives are somehow antithetical to free speech or assembly is completely absurd. It is not a mainstream view, and that sort of mischaracterization of just what progressivism is permeates this entire video. There are no progressives who oppose free speech. There are progressives, I think, who, think that there is some speech that is dangerous, but I don't think that progressives think that, Bernie Sanders shouldn't be able to speak at his own rally. I don't think anybody would go that far. I think that if they go that far, then they are people who are obviously, in the case of these Black Lives Matter women, they are very much, just in pain and acting irrationally and are not upholding progressive ideals. And again, he doesn't even make mention of the actual things that Black Lives Matter stands for, the things that both progressives and liberals agree on that they stand against. Again, there's a lot of cherry picking throughout this video. I'm going to use that phrase a lot throughout my notes and whatnot, because I do think that, Carl here is trying to build a very specific narrative of what progressivism is and what progressives do, and I think it's pretty disingenuous. And again, just to take these poor examples these poor excuses for progressives and generalize the entire movement based on them without actually even mentioning to the actual injustices that this movement stands against is pretty disingenuous. Bernie himself, Carl says himself that Bernie supports civil rights movements. He has supported civil rights movements all his life, and he supports Black Lives Matter, and is probably the most sympathetic candidate at that time he was a candidate to Black Lives Matter. So clearly by Sargon's own admission, or Carl's own admission, the women who cut off Bernie at his rally do not represent, people. They're not even representing Black Lives Matter well. They're not doing themselves any favors. He's just trying to build a narrative here. And then moving on, he basically does the same thing with this Sheffield University article he mentions about rape that seemingly advocates overturning the basis of a fair trial, which is the presumption of innocence in cases of rape, because there's a lot of rape is a very difficult situation, because you do and I admit there is a progressive desire to always come from a point of believing the victim of rape, because you never want to put a rape victim in the situation where they go to the police or they go to some other authority that's supposed to help them, and they're met with immediate scrutiny. You never want to, do that as, an investigative agency. But this Sheffield University article that Carl mentions basically is advocating for overturning the presumption of innocence in order to make getting rape convictions easier, which is obviously something that is problematic because removing the presumption of innocence is a huge deal because even as tough as it is and as much as you want to help rape victims, you still need to have the basis for a fair trial, because otherwise, a society falls apart without the presumption of innocence. The police and any other investigative agency obviously should, start from a place of believing the victim. But, because there are documented cases of women using false rape allegations to harm men that they dislike for whatever reason or another, or to, garner attention for themselves. It's happened to a lot of musicians. It happened to Connor Oberst from Bright Eyes. It happened to Isaac Brock from Modest Mouse. So there are documented legitimate cases where women have used rape allegations and other allegations of sexual assault to get back at or otherwise gain something from men, especially famous men. So, it's a very delicate issue because you need to be able to believe the victim as an investigator, but from the perspective of an objective legal authority, you also need to maintain the presumption of innocence and make sure that the plaintiff can, prove the allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. But anyway, that's basically what the Sheffield University article is arguing to overturn. But just because there are people out there who think that you should overturn the presumption of innocence, especially in sexual assault cases, that doesn't mean that it is an application of progressivism. Carl lists a bunch of different examples and articles about universities that have, decided to make it a lot easier to, not even investigate, but basically universities and other institutions that have sort of leaned into this this trend of believing the victim so much that you overturn the presumption of innocence of the accused. And again, I think that this is perhaps a very, very bad example of someone cherry picking ideas and throwing the label progressive on them after the fact. Remove the presumption of innocence is not a mainstream progressive ideal. I think that, for example, Carl says himself that Bernie Sanders is a progressive candidate. Does Bernie Sanders believe in removing the presumption of innocence? No. And so the idea that this is somehow a mainstream progressive ideal that is, really infiltrating the public consciousness is, again, I do think a little bit disingenuous. Are there people out there who want this, this absurd overturning of one of the basic principles of modern society? Yes. But I think that if I had to credit them with an ideology, I think I would probably apply the label of radical feminism to this. I don't think that this is a mainstream progressive ideal at all. I think that to label it as one is very disingenuous, and I think it just comes from a place of gender identity politics that not all progressives subscribe to. I think that generally speaking, progressives believe still in the basic presumption of innocence, and to imply otherwise is, again, pretty much just cherry picking and being disingenuous. And just as a little funny aside, at the end of this section about rape, Carl goes, "Have these people never even read Homer?" I mean, that doesn't obviously mean anything. It just means he's kind of a cunt. But anyway, moving on. Next, Carl decides to take on the example, or put forth the idea rather, that progressives somehow oppose free markets and free speech and free expression of companies because they go out on social media and protest certain brands and advertisements and such that they find unacceptable. For example, he uses the example of the very sexualized Spider-Woman cover where she's like, bending over in a weird position, and like you can see the entirety of her butt crack in her, skin-tight latex suit, which is kind of, it is ridiculous. I mean, I will agree with Carl that it is pretty normal for the series to have these characters be in, very skin-tight latex suits and whatnot. And there's also mention of an advertisement where that depicts a very classically beautiful, very physically fit a woman in an advert for, I forget what it's for, honestly. I think it's like some protein thing. I have no clue, but basically it's an advertisement depicting a very classically attractive woman that, is purportedly proposing some sort of, it's normalizing a certain body standard and can cause women to feel, shame about themselves. Is the idea that Carl is saying these progressives are, taking umbrage with. But anyway, both of these things, and he lists a couple more examples as well, but both of these things are, resulted at the time in big, social media campaigns against the brands, change.org online petitions to get them removed and such. And basically, Carl is arguing that doing this means that you are illiberal because you are standing against the principles of free markets and, free expression on the part of, say, the artist of that particular Spider-Woman cover, and you're prohibiting people, or you're trying to prohibit people from selling it. But the idea that progressives using social media to campaign for the removal of advertisements or products they perceive to be sexist, racist, or otherwise objectionable is protected under free speech. Carl makes a huge deal in this video of saying that liberals stand by free speech, whereas progressives do not, because they're concerned about more collectivist ideals than individual free speech. But how can you say that you are a liberal when you are saying that speaking freely, using the avenues of social media and, change.org petitions is objectionable to you? How can you be a champion of free speech if you're saying that campaigning against something you genuinely believe is wrong should not be protected? It's completely hypocritical, and here is where Carl moves from just disingenuous labeling, rather, to complete and utter hypocrisy, ideologically speaking. It's ultimately the companies. It's Marvel. It's that company with the advert with the very skinny blonde woman on it. It's ultimately the companies who decide whether or not to give into the pressure that is being applied to them from social media. It's their decision, the company's decision, to deny comic book fans, in this case, their right to buy the Spider-Woman cover in question. And the same goes for people lobbying people to get barred from entry to countries for being, pickup artists. At the end of the day, Carl's grief should be directed at the UK government, because he mentions this example of somebody who's a pickup artist being, barred from entry to the UK based on a lot of social media pressure. It's the UK government that ultimately makes that decision in this example, and it's the government that makes this decision in any of these examples, really. The progressive campaigns wield no, actual political authority. They're simply calling on those who do wield that political authority to take action. And calling on your representatives to take action is the definition of protected free speech. Again, the hypocrisy is insane. Carl here has the gall to quote Voltaire, or somebody paraphrasing Voltaire, who says, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. He has the gall to quote that, but he certainly doesn't want people voicing their opinions on social media or change.org. And those two things, to me, seem antithetical. I personally don't believe that people should be banned from the UK or any country really for being, pickup artists, which for those of you who don't know is basically men who give, YouTube video talks or seminars on how to, go out to bars and pick up women. It's very weird and creepy. Carl shows a clip of one guy named Roosh V talking about how he picks up women and he like hides in the corner of a room where nobody can see him, and then when women go up to the bar that he wants to talk to, he like walks up behind them so they turn around and he's right there, and he's like, oh yeah, and he basically is faking a meet cute or whatever. But, I don't believe that people should be banned from the UK for doing this. In the same way, I don't believe that they should have banned, Tyler, the Creator, from entering the UK or Australia because of his music's lyrical content. But people have the right to voice their concern, including a petition, which is, it's admittedly it's over the top, but they have the right to voice their concerns on social media to other people and using change.org if the social media platform and change.org want to allow it, because they're private platforms and they get to decide what goes on their platforms, which again is a liberal principle of the free market and companies having autonomy. People get to voice their concerns. It's free fucking speech, Carl. I personally, again, I don't believe it's the government's job to police what sort of art people consume in their countries and in their spaces. But if they decide to go along with what I will acknowledge is often a pretty reaction type movement thing, if they decide to go along with that, that's the government's overreach, not the overreach of the people who are concerned. They are still acting within another thing that Carl talks a lot about, which is the rule of law. It is, Carl gets a very big hard on throughout this video for the rule of law, the idea that, people have to act within the law and all this. But, how can you say that you're talking about the rule of law and you're this big liberal who champions the rule of law when you're basically saying, shut up if you don't like something? If you don't like something, your only option, your only ethical option is to just shut up and not speak about it. How is that within the rule of law? How is that in compliance with free speech ideals? How is that in compliance with any of these liberal principles that you're talking about? It's completely absurd. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. The government, you want to talk about the rule of law? The government has the right to deny the visa of a non-citizen. That's not even up for debate. It's no more up for debate. It's no more about freedom of movement or assembly than the fact that you need a work visa to go somewhere foreign and work. If that's not up for debate here, then neither is the idea that the government can deny a person a visa for basically any reason at their discretion. That's the rule of law. That's what the law says. So put it in your fucking sock and eat it. Or if that's a phrase, that thing people say, Carl. But anyway, and it's also worth mentioning, I think, that, I can see more progressives signing a petition to, deny entry to a pickup artist like this Roosh V guy that Carl mentions. I can see that more than I can see progressives lobbying for the overturning of the presumption of innocence itself. But I will still say that the idea that pickup artists should not be able to enter the country is not necessarily a mainstream progressive. It's not part of the mainstream progressive platform, so to speak. Again, this is an idea that is embraced by some progressives, but is more influenced directly by radical feminism, which I define as the type of feminism that is more concerned with punishment than equality. People who are concerned more with punishment than equality are not progressives, I would say, personally. There was a recent article in The Guardian, I believe, or one of those UK online newspaper type deals, where I believe a woman argued for removing the white emojis from phones so that white people can know what it feels like to not identify with your digital avatar, as minorities struggled with for so long. But progressivism is not about punishment. It is about equality. Anybody who doesn't get this can basically be lumped into the category of a radical, somebody who is so bitter and angry that they have gone beyond representing the mainstream opinions of progressives or feminists, etc., etc. Basically, people who don't understand that the goal is equality rather than, some kind of punitive measure. I wouldn't term them, again, mainstream feminists or mainstream progressives, and I wouldn't lump them in and try to use them, a few bad apples, so to speak, to use a tired metaphor. I wouldn't use them to characterize the main, lump of the movement or any kind of political ideology. And again, doing so is just part of this pattern of disingenuousness and cherry picking and misnomering that we see throughout Carl's entire video. And you might be wondering, just as a little bit of an aside here, this doesn't really have anything to do with the video itself, but if you're wondering why I call myself a feminist rather than, say, an egalitarian, it's mostly just a game of definitions. Women need help being, equal to men. There is a wage gap that affects women and not men. So the disparity is theirs, so they get the name of the movement, so to speak. That's the logic here. But what you really call it doesn't matter so much as you being on the same page, that there are disparities, that there is a wage gap, that there are things like that. There are ways in which women are held to double standards that men are not. If you're on the same page, it doesn't really matter if you call yourself a feminist, egalitarian, doesn't matter as long as you acknowledge these things. But moving back on to Carl's video. Like I said before, saying if you don't like it, shut up and ignore it is basically antithetical to free speech. It is antithetical to these liberal principles that Carl supposedly is a big defender of. If you have a problem, you have the right to voice your concerns as unnecessary or as what the hell fucking word is this? Frivolous. Or as unnecessary or as frivolous as they might appear to other people, myself included sometimes. For example, I don't think Roosh V is a fucking rapist or a sexual assaulter of any kind based on the video clips that Carl showed in his video. But I can understand why women would be made uncomfortable by his behavior. And, I can even understand to a lesser degree why people might be made uncomfortable by Tyler, the Creator's lyrics. Personally, I think that's an overreaction on both counts with both people that we're talking about right here, but I could try to understand it, and I can understand why a person might be, or might take, an objection to that. It's people's right to petition the government to work for them in the way they want. That is the essence of free speech in a modern society with a government. That is how it works. The idea that Carl complains about people petitioning and organizing on social media and then has the gall to mention the rule of law or Voltaire is completely laughable. In reference to people dumping what appears to be in this video that he shows in Sargon's video, or Carl's video, I should say. I gotta catch myself. But there's a video clip he shows where people appear to be dumping their drinks on Roosh V in Canada and harassing them in the streets and whatnot. I would again point out that this is an example of cherry picking. This is an example of, like with the Black Lives Matter people at the Bernie rally. This is an example of cherry picking videos of people failing to live up to their progressive ideals and saying, oh look, this is what progressives are all the time. This is their stated purpose. This is their stated platform. When in truth, these are progressives who are failing to live up to the progressive idea of nonviolence. Nonviolence, as far as I'm concerned, is a key component to the idea of progressivism. I mean, I don't think that pure pacifism rather has to be, but I think that generally nonviolence has to be part of the progressive ideal and the platform. Bernie Sanders, I believe, would agree with this. And you don't see him calling for violence. You see that from typically the alt-right and other opposing forces. So, I think generally nonviolence, if not pure nonviolence, is a core component of, progressivism. And, pointing out a video of people failing to live up to this ideal is just another example of many mischaracterizations that Carl commits in this video. To take it back to that skinny blonde lady advertisement as well, Carl also mentions that the ad was deemed appropriate by some unnamed, UK advertisement watchdog, and he uses that to try to justify how there's nothing wrong, literally, those are his words, with the advertisement that he references in the video, as if that sort of thing can be decided by some collective body who no doubt discusses in this collectivist voice that Carl is bemoaning throughout the entire video. He goes goes on and on about how there's a difference in the very way that progressives versus classical liberals speak. Classical liberals speak about, individuals and individual rights and privileges, whereas progressives rather speak about, the collective and groups, and they talk about groups and whatnot. And again, that is completely disingenuous. That is just such an oversimplification of the mindsets of these two supposedly very different. He calls them mutually exclusive groups, liberals and progressives. It is completely disingenuous, but the idea that liberals never talk about collectives and progressives never talk about individuals is just completely ridiculous, and that it's progressives ganging up on individuals always in groups and ignoring the fact completely that progressive groups are in turn made up of individuals with their own powers and powers of thought and powers of personal determination and agency and whatnot, as if they are just faceless collectives, faceless Borgs in the hive mind or whatever. But anyway, he talks a lot about how he hates this collectivist voice talking about the individuals, but I have no doubt that this unnamed UK advertisement watchdog that he mentions and uses it to justify there being nothing wrong with this skinny blonde lady, making bodily norms a problem in the UK. He uses their verdict to say that there's nothing wrong with this advertisement, basically, and I have no doubt that they talk about things in the collectivist voice over there. But just a little aside, I think, but it just goes to show the hypocrisy that he'll use anything that's convenient to justify his position. Whereas, I personally think there's nothing wrong with a skinny blonde lady in an advertisement, but you can't say that some watchdog out there makes it that true or not true in a more objective way than an individual's opinion. But anyway, I spent way too long on that. But the idea that it's the mob of progressives versus individuals discounts the fact that all these people signing all of these change.org petitions are themselves individuals who have considered their objections carefully. What about free association? Yet another of these liberal pillar principles that Carl talks a lot about. Do people not have the right to come together for a cause, even if that cause is to try to prevent one individual they genuinely believe to be dangerous from entering their country or entering their space in some way, shape, or form? As long as the outcomes are derived by legal means, and they absolutely are in all of these cases that he mentions, there is no liberal principle, there is no rule of law being violated here. It's completely ridiculous to say that there is. And then Carl moves on to freedom of the press. He says, he defines freedom of the press from either the dictionary or Wikipedia or something, but he says that the definition that he quotes from one of those places is obviously an archaic definition that needs to be updated to include freedom from social pressure, as the definition already includes freedom from government influence. I laughed out loud at this part of the video. Obviously, freedom of the press needs to be, it needs to include the idea that the press is free from social pressure, as if social pressure from individuals and groups within a society is equally objectionable as influence and corruption from above in the government. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of political ideology. I find it hard to believe that Carl even knows what classical liberalism is, although he does seem to, when he misunderstands that freedom of the press is about protecting the public from interference through the press from the government. It's preventing propaganda. It's preventing censorship from above, whereas social pressure comes from below and is people's right to express through their own freedom of speech and expression. How does a person misunderstand this? How does a person misunderstand the basic flow of these protections? I don't know, but this is just, I literally laughed openly at this. This is a complete absurdity. But, this is the most snowflakey, safe space thing I've ever heard in my entire life. Freedom from social pressure. Bitch, To exist in a society is to experience social pressure. People have a right to express, again, if they are offended. Again, I don't believe that the government needs to step in to police such things, but people have the right to ask. Again, I may not agree with what you're saying, but I defend to the death your right to say it. I am livid that fucking Mr. Carl Benjamin has the balls to quote that Voltaire bit, and yet does not believe that people can decide to exert social pressure on something. You know, he brings up the idea of the occurrence of the Charlie Hebdo shooting in France. And, you know, this is the one place that I can actually somewhat agree with this point. Free speech, I don't think, can be legislated down to what you know, has some sort of objectively verifiable societal merit, because that determination varies between regulatory bodies, it varies between individuals. There's no real consensus as to what, you know, real free speech or a free speech test is. I believe what he quotes from an article from France. There's no such thing as a free speech test, basically. But, you know, I will also say at the same time that Charlie Hebdo is extremely Islamophobic and is emblematic of a larger problem of xenophobia and Islamophobia throughout the world, and especially in France. And we kind of have a mirror issue here in the United States as well, especially with our current fucktard of a president. But people have every right to protest it and ask them to stop printing Charlie Hebdo if they find it you know, objectionable or racist or xenophobic or Islamophobic. They have the right to ask. Newsstands have a right to stop carrying it if they so choose. And, you know, to generalize that a little bit, private platforms like Twitter have a right to ban Islamophobic users from their site. You know, back when Charlie Hebdo got shot up and I think like 12 people died, there was this hashtag, Je suis Charlie, where you know, people were saying, you know, I stand with Charlie Hebdo, basically. But, you know, je n'étais pas Charlie. I was not Charlie, because, you know, not because I think they need to be banned from printing, but personally because, you know, even in a time of tragedy, I choose not to be associated with that sort of xenophobia and hate. If the KKK, if there were a KKK rally that got shot up tomorrow, I personally would not, you know, say, I am the KKK, because, you know, I felt bad that they died. I don't think that they necessarily deserve to die in this hypothetical, or in the case of the Charlie Hebdo shooting. I don't think that anybody deserves to die violently, no matter how disgusting their opinions are. And I think that most progressives would agree with me, despite what you might hear from some people on the alt-right. But I wouldn't stand with them. I wouldn't join you know, I wouldn't go to their vigil. I wouldn't, you know, join a hashtag campaign in sympathy with the KKK just because their clubhouse got shot up. So, you know, the idea that people who don't stand with Charlie Hebdo are simply anti-free speech is completely absurd, but that's what Carl is saying, basically. He's saying that Catholics, Muslims, and progressives banded together against free speech to protest Charlie Hebdo, but they're not against free speech. They're simply expressing themselves that they don't want to be associated with you know, this type of hate, or any type of hate, or anything that they perceive to be a type of hate. So it's not anti-free speech, it's using your free speech in a different way to make a moral determination about what you personally approve of and do not approve of, which, again, for the nth time, is protected free speech. And if we must, as Carl puts forth, allow speech, even if it has no societal merit, which I agree with, how can Carl then object to people's supposedly merit-free campaigns about sexualized comic book covers, thin women in advertisements, etc., etc.? It works both ways. Free speech defends people whose opinions you don't like. You said it yourself when you quoted Voltaire. I'm really just spinning in circles here, but he does it so many times throughout this video. He thinks that people who agree with him are fine, people who disagree with him should just shut up and not exercise their right to speech and expression and petitioning and social media, etc., etc. You know, Carl makes reference next to a Twitter harassment case wherein a man was basically, I forget if he was detained or he was sued, or basically he was in some kind of legal trouble for basically being unpleasant to a group of feminist, activist, progressive women online. In his reference to this case, he makes a reference to a letter given to the judge of that case that supposedly reveals the progressive complainants, or the plaintiffs, I guess is the word we use here, that they conspired to bring criminal charges against this man who had supposedly harassed them online. However, you know, it's funny, again, the utter hypocrisy here. He talks about in the video earlier the, you know, the requirement in a society to have the presumption of innocence. However, he basically is reading from this online article about this case. He never follows up on it. He never posts an article or quotes from an article that happened after the case was that, but he simply assumes that this letter that supposedly proves that the plaintiffs are basically committing this conspiracy to get this guy, you know, falsely imprisoned or whatever, he assumes their guilt. Because one article he read says that there was a letter delivered to the judge that said that they did this on a whim, this baseless accusation. He doesn't verify that later. He doesn't, you know, wait to see how the case develops. He says, oh yeah, that fits with my ideology. Look, there's two women who they're progressives. They got a man arrested and charged and sentenced for harassing them online when basically they made it up. But there is no confirmation in any of these articles that he made it up. He's just assuming their guilt. He's assuming that these plaintiffs are in turn guilty, which is hysterically stupid and hypocritical of Carl to do here, because you have to provide proof. If you're going to just quote this article where these women get this man falsely sentenced, you can't just quote from an article that's going on while the case is happening and then never follow up. But anyway, just another little example of the complete hypocrisy on display in this ridiculous fucking video. But anyway, the rest of these issues that he mentions throughout the last, I guess, third of the video is they basically fall victim to the same criticisms, generally speaking. People are, you know, just to repeat myself again, they're guaranteed the right to say what they want. The people have the right to tell those people to, you know, go somewhere else to say it as well if they're in a space, or if the offending person is saying their shit in a space that the people who want them to leave control. You have a right to, you know, manage your own space. That's, you know, private property rights that extends online in spaces you control. It's not an illiberal principle whatsoever. You know, a university can decide what goes on their grounds. Twitter can decide what it wants on their platform. Funnily enough, Sargon is banned from Twitter. Comic book vendors can choose what goes on their cover and whether or not they want to respond to social media pressure or not. Nothing Carl mentions, again, happens outside his precious rule of law. And while I will admit, again, that there are some progressives who, to me, seem ridiculously easily offended, as in the case of Tyler the Creator, more recently, very recently, in fact, Anthony Fantano, and even in the case of pickup artists like Roosh V, it would be socially authoritarian, the very thing that Carl is complaining about throughout this entire video. But it is socially authoritarian of me or anybody else to say, you know what, you're offended, sorry, that's not really offensive, so shut up, ignore it, stop petitioning, stop complaining. That is the most socially authoritarian message I have ever heard. It is certainly no less socially authoritarian to say, if you don't like it, shut up and don't do anything about it. You know, it's certainly just as authoritarian to say that as it is to say, oh, I don't like you, I believe you're a danger to this country and to women in this country because you're a pickup artist or something, don't come here. I'm going to ask the government not to let you to come here. I don't think that either of these things is any different. Just because it's an individual telling a person to shut up rather than a social media movement does not make it any less socially authoritarian of an idea or an action in principle. Carl is an utter hypocrite. And yes, I am mad that now I can't see Anthony Fantano on his tour because that tour was canceled in the wake of this Fader article that literally just came out a couple days ago. And I'd be mad if I lived in the UK and wanted to see Tyler the Creator, but I couldn't because they had banned him from the country. But, you know, to go back to a Louis C.K. bit that I'm very fond of mentioning, I think this is probably going to be the third time I've mentioned it in one of my Patreon videos. If people truly believed that abortion is murdering babies, then you have to sympathize and understand, maybe not sympathize, but certainly understand why they would be out in force protesting abortion, even if most people would say that the opinion that abortion is murdering babies is an overstatement. I would say that as well. But again, if people truly believe, for whatever reason, however they've been educated, that abortion is murdering babies, then you can understand why they would have such a forceful and vocal reaction to it. But in turn, you can exercise your rights to free yourself from having to listen to this, say, for example, anti-abortion shit in spaces you control. You can tell them to fuck off out of your space. But while you can do that, in turn, again, you can't just tell the anti-abortion people to just not be offended. You can't expect that from them. You can't expect them to not talk about it in their own spaces, or, for example, in a neutral space like, say, change.org that allows whatever. You know, fact is, being offended is just as protected as any other form of speech and is not some progressive phenomenon that defies and violates the principles of liberalism. You know, I don't really want to be listening to the KKK, anti-abortion activists, anti-global warming activists, or other archaic ideologies anymore. Not now, not in 20 years, not on my deathbed. But you know, I don't expect them to stop existing completely. I don't expect them to stop, you know, talking about it amongst themselves, but I don't want it in my space now or ever. You know, and I will use whatever tools I have at my disposal to keep that shit the fuck away from me. You know, Sargon makes reference to the no platform policy, which basically says that people with, you know, certain objectionable opinions shouldn't have a platform at universities, I believe, across the UK. And it sounds very snowflakey and safe spacey, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's really no different than me saying I don't want a KKK member in my house for the sake of diversity. Would a KKK member living with me challenge my worldview? Yes, technically yes. It doesn't mean I wouldn't kick his motherfucking ass to the curb in a heartbeat, though, and I think just about any other person, liberal, progressive, even Republican, would do the exact same goddamn shit, because who wants to tolerate that motherfucking type of shit in their own space? It's not a slippery slope either. There's a clear line between people who use free speech to attack and degrade others and those who do not. I don't want, you know, to hear those people now. Like I said, I don't want to be hearing them in 20 years from now because fucking fat dead Islamophobe Christopher Hitchens once quoted John Stuart Mill in a speech who said that the heretical position is always a valuable one. Sometimes the heretical position is a valuable one. Sometimes it's not. But to forego making that distinction and saying we must hear it all, wherever they want, all the time, is moronic. We're not simple machines that just have to get fucked and take whatever they give us. And there's a clear difference between someone speaking about banning abortion, advocating interfering with someone else's body, and someone saying, you know, leave my space with your views. One is offensive and one is defensive. That's the line. And we've basically now reached the end of the video, but, you know, of course, Carl in the description links to, of all things, fucking Breitbart. Breitbart, just, I mean, I don't think that Carl is necessarily a member of the alt-right, but he does sort of brush up on it in a way that is a little bit uncomfortable for me. I just think that's kind of sad and funny at the same time. But to sum it all up, basically the argument here is that it's culturally authoritarian to voice your disagreement with ideas or to exclude even the most disgusting ideas in your own space. But to me, it just sounds like people applying the principles of liberalism in a different way that Carl and people like Carl does not like. Or do not like, I think is the grammatically correct way to say that. But I don't think it's illiberalism. I think it's just liberalism applied in a way that he doesn't agree with. But he's not living up to his Voltairean quote that he likes to spout. I don't think by really saying that these people are not liberal and that they are in fact mutually exclusive ideologies, liberalism and progressivism, that is. But all I really know for sure is that if I never have to see white dudes in khakis chanting about how much they hate the Jews ever again, I really won't feel like I've lost out. And you know what? Fuck Christopher Hitchens to death. Oh wait, he's already dead. And would it have killed Carl to talk about, any of the things progressives and liberals actually stand for rather than against, and all the things that liberals and progressives also agree on and fight for or against? They fight for bodily autonomy, they fight for helping the poor and improving the lot of the poor in life. This whole thing seems just completely cherry-picked to me. I feel like I've been robbed of an hour and 12 minutes of my life watching this complete, hit job, basically, on the idea of progressivism based on a few bad examples coupled with a ton of complete hypocrisy. The fact that Carl eschews any overlap and literally says that liberalism and progressivism are mutually exclusive, his exact words, just shows how misinformed he is and how desperate he is to manufacture this narrative that progressives are this authoritarian group that only thinks as a collective and is hell-bent on stifling free expression, which is completely absurd, as I've demonstrated throughout my own video here, I believe. Don't get me wrong. I'm not someone who is, chomping at the bit to identify myself as a complete and total progressive all the way, 100% all the time. And progressives don't always get it right. Sometimes their concerns seem to me as foreign as anti-abortion activists' concerns. But to say that expressing your concerns is illiberal in and of itself. Just because Carl is railing against this group of progressives, and progressives often rail against individuals, doesn't make one better than the other. Carl is as authoritarian and is demanding as much of a safe space as any progressive that he's criticizing in this video. To sum it all up in a few points, voicing that you're offended is liberal. Excluding people from spaces you control is liberal. Just as Bernie, as Carl himself said, could reasonably and morally and ethically have excluded those Black Lives Matter protesters from his rally. He could have done that, morally speaking. I don't think a progressive would have disagreed with that. Third, censorship is bad, but controlling your own space is not censorship. And fourth and finally, people still have the right to go to their own spaces, assemble peaceably, and say whatever dumb shit they want to the people who want to hear it. This is, I believe, the progressive and liberal ideal, and I do not think in any way that they are mutually exclusive. Do progressives overreact? Do they get it wrong? In my opinion, yes. But to tell them that they have to shut up because you personally believe that they're fucking overreacting or wrong is in and of itself a violation of the liberal principle of free speech, assembly, expression, etc., and all the other things that Carl Benjamin, aka Sargon of Akkad, is complaining about over there in the UK. So, fuck you, you fat, dumb, neckbeard, total biscuit of pop philosophy. Eat my shit. Yeah. Get fucked. I'm obviously Jesus. I'm gonna go edit this video now. Yeehaw.